Okay, there is a lot to unpack here. You've probably heard the term the male gaze. Laura Mulvey coined it in the 70s, and since then, some humanities subjects have been going nuts using the hell out of this term. I'm looking at you, English Lit. The A-level or IB or high school, whatever America definitions of the male gaze is oversimplified. And of course, all for the purpose of gaining those easy context points in which you can proudly say to the examiner when they're marking your essay, "Hey, look at me, this is an A+ essay." Well, welcome to the real world where your grades no longer matter and where a quick Google search does not make you an A+ citizen. So sit down and allow me to explain Laura Mulvey's theory of the male gaze. For the purpose of keeping this video under 10 minutes, I will only be discussing the two pleasures of the male gaze, scopophilia and identification with the ego ideal, and not the nuances formed by the presence of the female figure on screen, which Mulvey uses Freud's theory of castration anxiety to explain. Yes, you heard me right. Castration anxiety. Shall we get started then? Scopophilia. What is it? In psychology, it means the gain of sexual pleasure from watching others naked or engaged in sexual activity. Looking itself is thus a source of pleasure, and opposing it, there is also pleasure in being looked at. In 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, Freud associated scopophilia with taking other people as objects, subjecting them to a controlling and curious gaze. The example he used, brace yourselves, is centered around the voyeuristic activities of children, and their desire to make sure of the private and forbidden. I know, classic Freud. In Mulvey's essay, she states that scopophilia is essentially active. She places emphasis on the look that's inducing pleasure rather than the being looked at. At the extreme, scopophilia can become fixated into a perversion, producing a sort of obsessive voyeur watching in an active, controlling way. The receiver of said gaze is then objectified. So, scopophilia is to do with pleasurable looking. Do you know what else relies heavily on pleasurable looking? That's right, cinema. This is because narrative and screening conventions separate the spectators from the movie and its contents within. This, to Mulvey, allows the spectators in the auditorium to engage in their scopophilic fantasies. Allow me to explain. According to Mulvey, the massive mainstream film and the narrative conventions within portray a hermetically sealed world that is indifferent to the presence of the audience. Thus, this produces a sense of separation from the narrative and its contents within, allowing for this hidden world of observation in the auditorium. In other words, the narrative will continue to unfold regardless of the spectator's involvement in its viewing. Thus, this essentially removes the spectator from the story, creating that sense of separation, and gives the spectators the illusion of looking into a private world. Screening conventions also produces this hidden world of observation in the auditorium. The extreme contrast between the darkness in the cinema, which Mulvey notes, also isolates the spectators from one another, and the brilliance of the shifting light and shade on the screen promotes the illusion of separation and encourages voyeurism. So how does looking at a screen lead to the objectification of women? Great question, young man. 1 gold star for you. According to Mulvey, pleasure in looking is split between the active male and the passive female. Women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, and their appearance coded for a strong visual and erotic impact in men, they become signifiers of male desire. In cinema, the presence of women is an indispensable element of spectacle in the normal narrative film. However, Mulvey also states that the visual presence of women in these films work against the development of the narrative, as their presence freezes the flow of action in moments of erotic contemplation. This disruption must then be integrated into cohesion with the narrative. As Bud Bottiger has put it, I know, perfect pronunciation, what counts is what the heroine provokes, or rather what she represents. She is the one, or rather the love or fear she inspires in the hero, or else the concern he feels for her, who makes him act the way he does. In herself, the woman has not the slightest importance. For example, take this gorgeous man out of the kissing booth, and we are left with this, the paragon of cringe. But I like Kissing Booth. No one likes Kissing Booth, -1 gold star. Traditionally, the woman is displayed on 2 levels. 1, she is the erotic object for the male characters in the story, and 2, she is the erotic object for the spectators in the auditorium. According to Mulvey, the device of the showgirl allows the 2 looks to be unified technically without any breaks in the narrative. In other words, both the spectator and the male character in the story engage in their voyeuristic fantasies simultaneously. Conventional close-ups of legs or a face produces that moment of narrative detachment in a different mode of eroticism. The use of close-ups fragments the body and destroys the Renaissance space, the illusion of depth, creating flatness and the quality of a cutout or icon. Regardless of the tools used, the erotic presentation of women in cinema freezes her shape into a passive and erotic image, creating what Mulvey refers to as woman as image. Let's move on to the second pleasure in the gaze, identification with the ideal ego. By now, it should be noted that the convention of mainstream cinema places its attention on the human form. Mulvey explains that the curiosity and the wish to look interweaves with a fascination for the likeness and recognition in the human face. Thus, not only does cinema satisfy a primordial wish for pleasurable looking, it also develops scopophilia in its narcissistic aspect. In this section, I will be discussing the constitution of the ego and its role in inducing pleasure through the temporary loss of ego and the identification with the ego ideal. I know, a bit of a mouthful, but it should make sense once I finish. Fingers crossed. Jacques Lacan, again perfectly pronounced by me, has described how the moment of when a child first recognizes its own image in the mirror to be crucial for the constitution of the ego. The mirror phase occurs at a time when the child's physical ambitions outstrip his motor capacity, with the result that his recognition of himself is joyous in that he imagines his mirror image to be more complete, more perfect than he experiences his own body. In other words, during the mirror phase, the child becomes aware of 2 articulations of itself. I am what I see in the mirror, empirical objectivity, and 2, I am what I imagine myself to look like, subjectivity. Thus, recognition is overlaid with misrecognition, the image that is conceived as a reflected body of the self, and misrecognition that projects this body outside of itself as an ideal ego. There are 2 ways in which pleasure is induced through the ego. According to Mulvey, the cinema has structures of fascination strong enough to allow temporary loss of ego, the sense of forgetting the world as the ego has subsequently come to perceive it. It occurs in those unconscious moments when you're so invested by the narrative world in front of you, you forget who you are or where you are. This, as Mulvey notes, is nostalgically reminiscent of that pre-self-awareness moment of image recognition. But you may ask, why does the spectator identify with the male character rather than objectifying him just like his female counterpart? On the surface, both characters are framed for display and to be looked at on the screen. So why is the gaze different when a male character is on the receiving end? According to the principles of the ruling ideology and the psychical structure that back it up, the male figure cannot bear the burden of sexual objectification. Hence, unlike the female, the male protagonist doesn't cause the spectator to look in moments of erotic contemplation. Instead of causing a break in the narrative, he is allowed to assume the role as the active one responsible for moving the action forward and making things happen. Thus, he emerges as a representation of power in the narrative, or as Mulvey puts it, as the bearer of the look of the spectator. This means not only is the gaze of the spectator directly in observation with the female form on screen, it is also radiated through a male star as he bears a similar gaze as the spectator. This process of identification with the male star is set in motion by structuring the film around a main controlling figure with whom the spectator can identify with. In addition, a male movie star's glamorous characteristics are those of the more perfect, more complete, and more powerful ego, similar to the ego ideal conceived in the original moment of recognition in front of the mirror. According to Mulvey, as a spectator identifies with the male protagonist, he projects his looks onto that of his like, so that the power of the male protagonist as he controls events coincides with the active power of the erotic look, both giving a satisfying sense of omnipotence. Similar to the controlling phase of the scopophilic instinct, the foundation for pleasure through identification with the ideal ego is also grounded on notions of control and possession. As the narrative progresses, the glamorous and sexualized female character falls in love with the male protagonist and becomes his property. Her previously outward, glamorous characteristics are now subjected to the male star alone. Thus, by means of identification with the male star and through participation in his power, the spectator can indirectly possess her too. Well, ain't that a jolly thing? To summarize, the male gaze is a way of masculine looking, constituted by the psychological instincts and socio-political conventions of heterosexual gender diversion that fantasizes and reorientates cinematic elements into signifiers of male desire. Mulvey theorizes two pleasures in the male gaze. Scopophilia, which is the pleasure gained from the active and controlling voyeuristic observation of female characters in the narrative, and identification with the ideal ego, which is pleasure gained from identifying with a more complete and more perfect ego outside of one's own body and living vicariously through him. Hence, while this is the male gaze, this is also the male gaze. Well, this is it. But Peter, what about all of that? What is that about? Shh, this is a university assignment. I have a time limit. Unless you want me to stretch the video up to 20 minutes and talk about the reasons that Mulvey theorizes about why men instinctually objectify women. Do you want me to go on about how Mulvey associates the scopophilic instinct with sadism? Do you want me to talk about Freud's theory of castration theory? Well, maybe you do, but just read the essay. Who better to explain the theory to you than the person who invented it? But just so you know, there's a fair share of Freud in there. You have been warned. Thank you for watching the video. In all seriousness, I am no expert in the topic, so please do correct me in the comments if I'm inaccurate in any of my analysis. Hopefully you would have learned something new, and I would really encourage you all to read her essay because it is very interesting, and simply being aware of the theory will improve your stance on the topic. The essay will be linked in the description below. Also, thank you CGP Gray for letting me steal his studio. Okay, bye!